The story of the darkest chapter in the history of Krakow begins not with the thunder of artillery, but with the eerie silence of a sunny September morning in 1939. While Warsaw was burning under the relentless bombardment of the Luftwaffe, Krakow, the ancient seat of Polish kings, was captured almost intact. The Nazis did not want to destroy this city, they wanted to steal it. They saw in its Gothic spires and Renaissance courtyards a reflection of their own Germanic mythology. And so, on September 6, 1939, the Wehrmacht marched into the main market square not as destroyers, but as new owners. They tore down the Polish eagles and replaced them with the swastika. They did not know it yet, but they were turning one of Europe's most beautiful cities into a slaughterhouse that would operate for 5 years, 3 months, and 12 days. Within weeks, Krakow was stripped of its identity. It was no longer a Polish city, it was declared the capital of the general government, a colonial empire carved out of the occupied East. Berlin appointed a man named Hans Frank to rule this new dominion. Frank was a lawyer by training, a sophisticated lover of art, and a ruthless sociopath by nature. He did not establish his headquarters in a drab administrative building. His vanity demanded a throne. He moved into the Wawel Castle, the sacred necropolis of Polish monarchs. He evicted the ghosts of the past and installed himself as the King of Poland. Under Frank's rule, the city underwent a grotesque transformation. The main market square was renamed Adolf Hitler Platz. The statue of Adam Mickiewicz, the Polish national poet, was toppled and destroyed. Trams were segregated. The front cars, clean and heated, were reserved nur für Deutsch, only for Germans, while Poles were crammed into the rear. The city became a playground for the Nazi elite. While the local population faced starvation rations, losing their homes and their rights, German officials moved into luxury apartments requisitioned from wealthy Jewish families. They filled the theaters, the opera house, and the cafes. They lived a life of surreal luxury, drinking French champagne and listening to Wagner, believing that they had established a civilization that would last 1,000 years. But the true power in Krakow did not reside in the opulent halls of the Wawel Castle. It lay a few kilometers away in a gray, imposing building at No. 2 Pomorska Street. Before the war, this building had been a dormitory for Silesian students, a place of youth and learning. The Nazis turned it into the headquarters of the Geheime Staatspolizei, the Gestapo. To understand the scale of the terror, one must look at the anatomy of this building. It was a factory designed for the production of pain. The upper floors were deceptively mundane. Here, bureaucrats and secretaries worked with chilling efficiency. They typed arrest warrants, filed interrogation reports, and organized transport lists for the concentration camps. It was a sterile administrative hell. But beneath the polished floors lay the cellars. These were the torture chambers. The Krakow Gestapo was notorious even among the SS for its brutality. They did not merely want information, they wanted to break the human soul. The methods used at Pomorska Street were medieval. Prisoners were thrown into tram cells, rooms so crowded that men had to stand for days, pressing against one another, unable to sit or sleep. Those selected for sharpened interrogation faced horrors that defied description. They were beaten with steel rods and leather whips tipped with lead. They were subjected to the water cure, drowned in bathtubs until their lungs filled with fluid, only to be revived and drowned again. They were hung by their wrists from hooks in the ceiling, their arms dislocated, left to swing for hours while Gestapo officers took smoke breaks. The names of the torturers became whispered legends of fear on the streets of Krakow. Men like Rudolf Botz and Arnold Sepp presided over this kingdom of shadows. They walked the streets of the city in their leather coats, treated like celebrities by the German occupiers and like demons by the Polish population. They operated with total impunity. A simple nod from a Gestapo officer on the street could mean death. A wrong look could mean arrest. The terror was systematic. It began with the intelligentsia. The Nazis knew that to enslave a nation, they first had to decapitate it. In November 1939, in an operation known as Sonderaktion Krakow, the Gestapo invited the professors of the Jagiellonian University to a lecture on German science. It was a trap. Over 180 of the finest minds in Poland, professors, scientists, historians, were arrested, beaten, and deported to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Many never returned. This was the signal to the people of Krakow: no one is safe. If the most respected men in the city could be taken, then anyone could be taken. Life in Krakow became a game of Russian roulette. The most terrifying aspect of the occupation was the Lepunka, the roundup. It could happen anywhere. A truck would pull up to a tram stop. Soldiers would jump out, cordon off the street, and arrest everyone in sight. Men, women, teenagers, it didn't matter. They were loaded onto trucks and taken to Primorska Street or the dreaded Montelupich prison. Some were sent to forced labor in the Reich, some were shot the same day, many were shipped to Auschwitz, which lay only an hour's drive to the west. Montelupich prison became the waiting room for hell. Built in the 19th century, it was designed to hold a few hundred criminals. Under the Gestapo, it held thousands. Conditions were catastrophic. Typhus and dysentery ran rampant. Prisoners slept on concrete floors in their own filth. The screams from the interrogation rooms echoed through the corridors day and night, a constant psychological torture for those waiting for their turn. And yet, even in this abyss, the human spirit flickered. A secret communication network was established. Prisoners tapped Morse code on the pipes. They smuggled tiny notes, gripsy, hidden in laundry or bread, passing information to the resistance outside. They knew that the underground state was watching. For the Jewish population of Krakow, the situation was even more desperate. They were slowly being strangled. First, they were forced to wear the Star of David armbands. Then, they were stripped of their businesses and bank accounts. Finally, in March 1941, they were walled up in the ghetto in the Podgorski district. 15,000 people were crammed into an area meant for 3,000. The windows facing the Aryan side of the city were bricked up. The ghetto became a cage. The Gestapo treated the ghetto as their personal hunting ground. Officers like Ermine, who would later command the Plaszow camp, visited the ghetto to kill for sport. The terror was absolute. By 1942, the Nazi grip on Krakow seemed unbreakable. Hans Frank reigned supreme in his castle, hosting grand banquets for visiting dignitaries like Heinrich Himmler. The Gestapo at Primorska Street had silenced the initial waves of resistance. The city was quiet, paralyzed by fear. But it was a deceptive silence. Beneath the cobblestones, in the basements and attics, something was growing. The initial shock of the defeat was wearing off. The Polish Home Army, Armia Krajowa, was organizing. They were building a shadow army right under the noses of the Gestapo. They were gathering intelligence, stockpiling weapons, and mapping the movements of the German High Command. The Germans believed that they had crushed the spirit of Krakow. They were wrong. They had only compressed it. And like a compressed spring, the resistance was waiting for the moment to snap back. The golden age of the Krakow Gestapo was about to end. The hunters were about to become the hunted. As the war turned against Germany on the Eastern Front, the atmosphere in the Devil's capital began to shift. The absolute power of men like Hans Frank and Wilhelm Kopp was about to be challenged in the most violent way possible. The stage was set for a bloody confrontation that would turn the streets of this ancient city into a battlefield.
Part 2. The Assassins and the Black Terror, 1943 to 1944. By 1943, the atmosphere in occupied Europe had changed. The invincibility of the Wehrmacht had been shattered at Stalingrad. The Allies had landed in Italy. And in the heart of the general government, the silence of Krakow was no longer a sign of submission. It was the quiet before the storm. The Polish underground state, operating right beneath the boots of the Gestapo, had decided that the time for passive resistance was over. They declared a new doctrine, an eye for an eye. The terror inflicted by the Germans would be met with targeted strikes against the leadership of the occupation. The hunters were about to become the prey. The target chosen by the High Command of the Home Army, Armia Krajowa, was the highest-ranking SS officer in Poland, Obergruppenführer Wilhelm Kapp. Kapp was a man who embodied the banality of evil. He had replaced the previous security chief, Friedrich Kruger, and immediately escalated the brutality. Kapp was a technocrat of genocide. Before arriving in Krakow, he had pioneered the use of gas vans to murder patients in mental asylums in the Warthegau region. He was the architect of the Chelmno death camp. Upon his arrival in the Wawel Castle, he issued a directive that ordered the immediate execution of 50 to 100 Poles for every single German killed by the resistance. He turned mass murder into a mathematical formula. To the Polish resistance, he was not just a general, he was a rabid dog that had to be put down. But killing Kapp seemed like a suicide mission. He was the most guarded man in the general government. He lived in the heavily fortified Wawel Castle and traveled to his office in the police academy in a convoy. He rode inside a custom-built armored Mercedes-Benz surrounded by bodyguards armed with MP-40 submachine guns. He never traveled alone, and his routes were constantly monitored. To strike at such a target in the heart of the German capital required a level of audacity that bordered on madness. The Home Army assigned this mission to its elite unit, the Parasol Battalion. The soldiers of Parasol were not hardened war veterans in the traditional sense. They were the generation of Columbuses, students, Boy Scouts, young poets and intellectuals, most of them in their early 20s. They had grown up in a free Poland only to see it crushed. They traded their textbooks for Sten guns and their classrooms for the sewers and back alleys of urban warfare. They were disciplined, fearless, and motivated by a burning, cold hatred for the occupier. In the early summer of 1944, a group of these young men and women traveled from Warsaw to Krakow. They moved in small groups, carrying false documents, smuggling weapons in suitcases and musical instrument cases. The logistical challenge was immense. They had to operate in a strange city, saturated with Gestapo agents and German soldiers. They set up safe houses, stole cars, Chevrolets and Mercedes to use in the attack, and began a meticulous surveillance of the target. For weeks, young girls serving as couriers sat on park benches near the Wawel Castle, pretending to read books while secretly clocking the movements of the general's convoy. They learned his schedule. They learned his route. The date was set, July 11, 1944. The location, Powierzchła Street. The choice of location was symbolic and tactical. Powierzchła Street ran just beneath the towering walls of the Wawel Castle. It was an open challenge. They were going to kill the Nazi warlord right on his doorstep. At 8 a.m. on that fateful Tuesday, the commandos took their positions. The operation was led by Stanislav Leopold, codename Rafał. He commanded a team of some of the best urban fighters in Europe. They waited in their stolen cars, engines idling, sweating in the July heat, their hands gripping the cold steel of their Sten submachine guns and Filipinka hand grenades. The tension was suffocating. Every passing German patrol, every glance from a policeman could blow their cover. At 9:17 a.m., the signal came from the observers. The general is coming. The gray, six-wheeled Mercedes-Benz of Wilhelm Kapp turned the corner onto Powierzchła Street. It was moving fast. Inside sat the general and his adjutant. In the front seat, the SS driver and a bodyguard. As the limousine approached kill zone, the Polish blocking car, a heavy Chevrolet, roared out from the curb and slammed on its brakes, blocking the narrow street. The plan was to force the general's car to stop, surround it, and riddle it with bullets. But plans in war rarely survive the first contact. The SS driver, a veteran of high-speed maneuvers, did not stop. Seeing the blockade, he made a split-second decision. He didn't slam on the brakes. He slammed on the accelerator. He swerved onto the sidewalk, tires screeching, intending to bypass the Chevrolet.
Chaos erupted. "Fire!" shouted Wawel. The silence of the Krakow morning was shattered by the deafening rattle of automatic fire. The parasol fighters jumped from their vehicles. Dozens of bullets struck the Mercedes. The glass shattered, spiderwebbing instantly, but the heavy armor plating held. The bullets sparked off the steel chassis. Coupe, realizing he was under attack, threw himself onto the floor of the car. The fight descended into a brutal close-quarters brawl. The parasol fighters threw grenades. Boom! Boom! Smoke filled the street. The Mercedes, damaged and riddled with holes, kept moving. The driver, though likely wounded, managed to keep control of the heavy vehicle. He drove on the rims, pushing the engine to its limit, swerving through the hail of gunfire. The German bodyguards in the trailing car opened fire on the partisans. A fierce gun battle raged for seconds that felt like hours. The air smelled of cordite and burning rubber. Then, tragedy struck the attackers. As the Mercedes sped away, escaping the trap, the partisans tried to pursue, but the confusion and the heavy German return fire made it impossible. Coupe had escaped. The order to retreat was given. The parasol unit piled into their getaway cars. But the escape was just as dangerous as the attack. They had to outrun the entire Krakow police force. A wild car chase ensued through the streets of the city. In the process, several brave partisans were wounded. Some would later be captured and tortured to death by the Gestapo, refusing to give up their comrades. Wilhelm Coupe survived. He was pulled from the wrecked car at the police academy, shaken, covered in glass but alive. However, the operation was not a total failure. It was a massive psychological victory. The myth of German safety in Krakow was destroyed forever. The Nazis realized that even in their capital, even under the walls of their castle, they were vulnerable. The bandits, as they called them, could strike anywhere. The reaction of the German occupiers was predictable and terrifying. A wounded beast is the most dangerous. Humiliated by the attack, Coupe and Governor Frank unleashed a wave of vengeance that would be remembered as the Black Terror. The Gestapo went into a frenzy. They didn't care about finding the specific shooters. They wanted to punish the entire city. They wanted to drown the resistance in blood. The culmination of this rage came on Sunday, August 6, 1944. It was a day that would be etched into the memory of Krakow as Black Sunday, Czarna Niedziela. Fearing that the Warsaw Uprising, which had erupted just days earlier on August 1st, would spread to Krakow, the Germans launched a preemptive strike of massive proportions. They did not target specific suspects. They targeted the population. Thousands of SS troops, police, and Gestapo agents flooded the streets. They set up checkpoints at every major intersection. They cordoned off entire districts. It was a manhunt. Men were dragged off trams on their way to church. Fathers were pulled from their Sunday lunch tables. Teenagers were snatched from the parks. There were no questions asked, no papers checked. If you were a male of military age, you were an enemy. Over 6,000 men were arrested in a single day. The Montelupik prison overflowed. The cells were packed so tight that men fainted from lack of oxygen. When the prison was full, the overflow was sent to the Plaszow concentration camp on the outskirts of the city. The Gestapo began to empty the jails by the only method they knew: mass execution. The forests around Krakow echoed with the sound of gunshots. In the courtyards of the prisons, the firing squads worked in shifts. The autumn of 1944 was a nightmare. The city lived in a state of suspended animation. People were afraid to speak, afraid to walk the streets, afraid to look out their windows. The sky over the city was often dark with smoke from the crematoria of Plaszow and Auschwitz. Inside the Gestapo headquarters on Pomorska Street, the torturers worked overtime. They knew the war was going badly. The Red Army was pushing through Ukraine. The Allies were marching on Paris. But this knowledge only made them crueler. They wanted to leave no witnesses behind. Yet, even in this darkest hour, the resistance did not break. The attack on Coupe had proven that the Germans bled. The Black Terror decimated the ranks of the Home Army, but it did not kill the spirit of the city. As the winter snows began to fall in late 1944, a new sound began to drift over the city from the east. At first, it was a low rumble, like distant thunder. Then it became a constant tremor in the ground.
The front line was moving. The Vistula-Oder offensive was about to begin. The time of the hunters was ending. The time of the runners was about to begin. The Nazi Empire in Krakow, built on 5 years of sadism and theft, was about to collapse in a chaotic, shameful finale.
Part 3. The Flight of the Rats and the Survival. January 1945. As the year 1944 bled into 1945, the winter in Krakow was exceptionally cold. The snow piled high against the medieval walls, muffling the sounds of the city. But there was one sound that the snow could not silence: the deep, rhythmic thumping of heavy artillery coming from the east. It was the heartbeat of the approaching front. To the Polish population, huddled in unheated apartments, it was the sound of hope. To the German occupiers, who had spent 5 years living like kings, it was the sound of doom. The 1,000-year Reich in Poland was collapsing, and it was collapsing fast. On January 12, 1945, the Soviet Red Army launched the Vistula-Oder offensive. It was a military tidal wave. Millions of soldiers and thousands of tanks smashed through the German defensive lines. The Wehrmacht, exhausted and outnumbered, began to disintegrate. In Krakow, the capital of the general government, the atmosphere shifted overnight from arrogance to blind panic. The master race began to pack. Inside the Wawel Castle, Governor General Hans Frank, the self-proclaimed King of Poland, revealed his true nature. He was not a warrior, he was a thief. He did not spend his final days organizing the defense of the city or caring for the wounded German soldiers. He spent them curating his loot. Frank was obsessed with the art treasures he had stolen from Polish museums and churches. He ordered special trains to be prepared at the railway station. In a scene of grotesque greed, SS officers were seen carrying masterpieces wrapped in blankets down the castle stairs. The Lady with an Ermine by Leonardo da Vinci, The Landscape with the Good Samaritan by Rembrandt, golden chalices, tapestries, and medieval manuscripts, all were loaded into the governor's personal wagons. On January 17th, just 48 hours before the Soviets arrived, Hans Frank fled. He slipped out of the city he claimed to love, leaving behind a power vacuum and the population holding its breath. While Frank was busy stealing art, the men at No. 2 Pomorska Street were busy trying to erase history. The Gestapo headquarters became a hive of frantic activity. The order from Berlin was explicit: leave no trace. The Nazis knew that if the archives fell into Allied hands, every agent, every informer, and every crime would be exposed. The shredders ran until they overheated. In the central courtyard of the building, massive bonfires were lit. Truckloads of files, interrogation protocols, lists of undercover agents, death sentences were thrown into the flames. The air over the district of Krovodra filled with the acrid smell of burning paper and ash. It was the smoke of a criminal organization trying to cover its tracks. But paper was easy to destroy. Witnesses were flesh and blood. In these final, chaotic hours, the Krakow Gestapo committed their last and perhaps most senseless crimes. They couldn't transport all the prisoners held in the overcrowded cells of Montelutich and Pomorska, and they were terrified of leaving them alive to testify. On January 15th, just 4 days before the liberation, a truckload of prisoners was driven to the Domby district. There, 79 people were lined up and shot. It was killing for the sake of killing, a final spasm of violence from a dying regime. The German plan for Krakow was simple and horrific: scorched earth. They did not intend to leave the city intact. Hitler had declared that no major city should fall into enemy hands undamaged. German combat engineers, pioneers, had spent weeks preparing. They drilled holes into the pillars of the bridges spanning the Vistula River. They packed explosives into the basements of historic monuments, utility plants, and the castle itself. Krakow was rigged to blow.
The plan was to turn this jewel of architecture into a second Warsaw, a pile of smoking rubble. But history and military strategy intervened. The Soviet commander, Marshal Ivan Konev, made a decision that would save the city. He knew that a direct artillery bombardment and a street-by-street siege would destroy Krakow. Instead, he chose a maneuver of speed. On January 18th, Soviet tank columns punched through the German lines north of the city and swung around in a massive pincer movement. They threatened to encircle the German garrison completely. The German commanders in Krakow panicked. They realized that if they stayed the fight for every street, they would be trapped and annihilated. The order was given to retreat immediately. It was a chaotic flight. The roads leading west were clogged with retreating Wehrmacht units, horse-drawn carts, and desperate Nazi officials trying to outrun the T-34 tanks. In the confusion and haste, the chain of command broke down, and the order to detonate the city was given, but it was only partially executed. The bridges over the Vistula River were blown up, crumbling into the icy water. But the cables leading to the city's historic core were cut. Legends say that Polish resistance fighters and Soviet scouts cut the wires at the last second. Others say the German engineers simply ran away, caring more about their own lives than destroying a city they had already lost. On the morning of January 19th, 1945, a strange silence fell over Krakow. The Gestapo patrols were gone. The sentries at the Wawel were gone. Then the first Soviet tanks rolled into the market square. There was no heavy fighting in the center. The city stood frozen, covered in snow, but alive. The medieval cloth hall, the St. Mary's Basilica, the Wawel Castle, they were all still standing. The people of Krakow emerged from their cellars like sleepwalkers. They walked into the main market square and looked up. The giant swastika flags that had draped the buildings for 5 long years were torn down. They were trampled into the dirty slush by the boots of the survivors. The occupation was over. Epilogue. The echoes of silence. In the days following the liberation, the citizens of Krakow dared to approach the building at number 2 Pomorska Street. The gates were open. The guards were gone. They entered the House of Silesia with trembling hearts. They found offices strewn with paper, overturned desks, and half-eaten meals left by fleeing officers. But it was the cellars that held the true horror. The walls of the detention cells were covered in inscriptions, thousands of names, dates, crosses, and final messages scratched into the plaster by men and women who knew they were about to die. Marek was here. God save Poland. Tell my mother I didn't talk. These walls spoke. They were the only witnesses left. And what of the monsters who ruled this city? Justice was mixed. Hans Frank, the arrogant king, was captured by American troops in May 1945. He was put on trial at Nuremberg. Confronted with his own diaries, volumes of evidence detailing his crimes, he tried to convert to Catholicism and repent. It didn't save him. He was hanged on October 16, 1946. But Wilhelm Keuper, the target of the brave parasol assassins, the man who unleashed the Black Terror, had a different fate. He vanished. Using a fake name, Lohmann, he became a director of a chocolate factory in West Germany. He lived a quiet, comfortable life for years. He was eventually discovered and arrested in 1960, but he never faced true justice. The trial was delayed due to his poor health, and he died a free man in his bed in 1975. A bitter pill for the families of his thousands of victims. Today, Krakow is a vibrant, bustling city. Tourists drink coffee in the square where Nazis once marched. The Wawel Castle is a museum of Polish history, not a German fortress. But number 2 Pomorska Street remains. It is a museum now, a branch of the Historical Museum of the city of Krakow. It is a quiet place. You can walk down into the cellars. You can stand in the damp, cold cells where the Gestapo once reigned supreme. And if you look closely at the walls, you can still see the names. They are the scars of the city. They are the reminder that while the regimes of terror may rise with terrifying speed, and while they may seem invincible, they all eventually fall. The Gestapo is gone. Krakow remains.